And the first thing out of Liz's mouth is, we've got to get rid of him.
She was television's sweetest witch. He was her charming mortal husband. But behind every nose twitch lay hidden animosities, insidious flirtations, painful addictions, on-set chaos that turned affection into animosity. And though millions loved them as Samantha and Darren, Elizabeth Montgomery couldn't forgive the man behind the magic. Now, the shocking truth finally comes to light. From the outside, Bewitched looked like pure magic. Elizabeth Montgomery sparkled as Samantha, the enchanting witch who tried to live a normal suburban life, while Dick York played the charming but constantly exasperated mortal husband, Darren. Together, they created one of the most iconic couples in television history. Viewers saw chemistry, banter, and a believable romance that kept people tuning in week after week. But what the audience didn't know was that when the cameras stopped rolling, that chemistry quickly turned to tension. Elizabeth Montgomery was the ultimate professional. She wanted clean takes, precise delivery, and a set that ran smoothly. York, on the other hand, carried a chaotic energy. He was funny, warm, and deeply likable, but also unpredictable. His colleagues described him as someone who would swing from bouts of energy and charm to sudden silence or exhaustion. To the cast, it sometimes seemed like two different people lived inside him. At first, Montgomery tolerated it. After all, actors can be eccentric. But as filming went on, patience began to wear thin. The real spark of tension came from something no one could control: York's growing attachment to his co-star. On screen, his adoration of Samantha fit the script perfectly. Off-screen, however, it started to bleed into reality. York reportedly developed a crush on Montgomery, and though he never crossed a line in a direct way, his attention toward her was obvious. Crew members noticed, other actors whispered, and Montgomery herself grew uncomfortable with what felt less like admiration and more like fixation. What the world saw as perfect chemistry, she began to see as unwanted pressure. Adding fuel to the fire was the way York's infatuation mixed with his declining health. His behavior was unpredictable, sometimes affectionate, other times irritable. For Montgomery, who was balancing the demands of being the show's central star, the wife of producer Bill Asher, and a perfectionist in her craft, the weight of dealing with York's moods became a burden. The tension wasn't explosive. There were no screaming matches, no public meltdowns, but it was insidious. Quiet, gnawing resentment built up over time until it became impossible to ignore. The studio executives noticed too. Behind the scenes, whispers circulated about York's reliability, his health, and his behavior toward Montgomery, but nothing could be done right away. Bewitched was a hit, and the network wasn't willing to break apart the on-screen marriage that millions adored. So, the set became a place where unspoken tensions simmered. Montgomery smiled on camera, but off-camera, her patience frayed. Still, no one could have predicted how far things would spiral, or that one shocking collapse would turn the tension into something she would never forgive. What seemed like subtle irritation soon exploded into a full-blown crisis, triggered by York's secret struggles that few people knew about. Elizabeth Montgomery was used to attention. She was beautiful, witty, and carried herself with a quiet confidence that made people gravitate toward her. But what she wasn't used to, at least on set, was the persistent, almost awkward affection of her co-star. Dick York's feelings for her became something of an open secret among the cast and crew. He admired her, not just as Samantha, but as Elizabeth. It wasn't malicious. York wasn't aggressive or threatening, but the constant puppy dog looks, the compliments, and the longing energy he carried around her created an uncomfortable dynamic. For Montgomery, it blurred a line she never wanted crossed. She was married to Bill Asher, the show's producer, and their relationship was already complicated enough under the pressures of Hollywood. Having her leading man fawning over her off-screen made things worse. Instead of focusing on the work, she had to navigate York's unspoken feelings and the awkwardness they caused in everyday interactions. Even a simple scene could feel strained when his real-life admiration bled through, making it harder to separate acting from reality. Some insiders believed York's behavior stemmed from loneliness. His marriage was strained, his health was deteriorating, and the set of Bewitched became the one place he felt alive. Montgomery, meanwhile, was the shining center of that world. It's not surprising he latched onto her presence, but to Montgomery, it felt like a burden she couldn't shake. She reportedly described it as dealing with a man who just wouldn't stop hovering, a constant distraction from her craft. The frustration deepened when York's infatuation began to affect his professionalism. Crew members whispered that he sometimes lingered too long in her space, tried too hard to make her laugh, or gave the impression that he was desperate for her approval. To Montgomery, a perfectionist who valued efficiency and control, this wasn't charming, it was irritating. The puppy dog problem became a wedge, quietly pushing her further away from him emotionally, even as their characters were supposed to be madly in love on screen. And this wasn't something she could easily talk about. To confront him directly risked humiliation for York, and to complain to producers risked creating bigger drama than she wanted. So, Montgomery did what many actors do. She kept smiling for the cameras while privately storing away every moment of frustration. But resentment has a way of building, and what started as awkward admiration slowly turned into a quiet feud she carried with her for years. York, however, was fighting battles no one fully understood, and as his personal struggles deepened, the awkwardness on set gave way to something far more troubling, something that would soon send the entire production spiraling out of control. What most people didn't realize at the time was that Dick York's strange behavior wasn't just about emotions, it was about survival. Years before Bewitched, York suffered a devastating back injury while filming the movie They Came to Cordura. A scene gone wrong left him with torn muscles along his spine, and the pain never fully went away. He lived with it every single day, and by the time he stepped onto the set of Bewitched, the injury was controlling his life. At first, York tried to manage it with sheer willpower, but Hollywood schedules are grueling, and sitcom filming meant long hours under hot lights, with constant movement, retakes, and physical comedy that pushed his body past its limit. Painkillers became his crutch. What started as a necessity turned into dependence. York began leaning heavily on prescription medication, and when the pills weren't enough, alcohol filled the gaps. His warm charm could flip into irritability, confusion, or exhaustion, all depending on how his body and mind were reacting that day. Elizabeth Montgomery wasn't blind to this. She watched it unfold up close. On some days, York was the sweet, funny man she could laugh with. On others, he was short-tempered, unfocused, or visibly suffering. For an actress who prided herself on professionalism, the unpredictability was maddening. Scenes were delayed, energy was drained, and patience wore thin. Montgomery began to see him less as a co-star and more as a liability. The tragedy is that York wasn't careless. He was desperate. The more he relied on painkillers, the less control he seemed to have over his body and his performance. Crew members described him as sweating profusely, trembling at times, or staring blankly between takes. And while many sympathized with his struggle, Montgomery reportedly lost that compassion as the years dragged on. Instead of seeing a man in pain, she began to see a man whose personal problems were dragging her show and her reputation down with him. It didn't help that Bill Asher, her husband and the show's producer, was growing frustrated with York as well. Asher wanted smooth sailing, and York's struggles made that impossible. Montgomery, caught between being a supportive co-star and protecting the interests of her marriage and career, chose distance. She would show kindness in public, but privately, her tolerance for York's suffering had reached its limit. The downward spiral was unstoppable. As York's pain worsened, so did his dependence, and the tension on set became unbearable. Montgomery and York still delivered their lines as though Samantha and Darren were the perfect couple, but off-camera, the gap between them was growing wider every single day. Then, in one shocking moment, everything came crashing down, literally, when York's body finally gave out in the middle of filming. It happened suddenly, but the signs had been there all along. The long hours, the physical demands, and the cocktail of painkillers finally caught up to Dick York during the filming of Bewitched. In the middle of a scene, with cameras rolling and crew watching, York collapsed. His body gave out completely, leaving everyone stunned. For a few terrifying moments, people thought he might not get back up at all. Production screeched to a halt. York was rushed out, and the atmosphere on set shifted from confusion to dread. This wasn't just a missed line or a late arrival. This was a man's body breaking down before their eyes. For Elizabeth Montgomery, it was the moment she could no longer separate fiction from reality. Darren, the doting husband, might have been dependable in the scripts, but Dick York was proving to be anything but. In Hollywood, reliability is everything. Stars are expected to show up, hit their marks, and carry the weight of multi-million-dollar productions. When York collapsed, it wasn't just his health at stake. It was the stability of the entire show. Montgomery reportedly felt betrayed. She had carried Bewitched on her shoulders, becoming the face of the show and the anchor of its success. Now, her co-star's unpredictable health was threatening to pull the rug out from under all of it. The collapse exposed the fragility everyone had been trying to ignore. Executives who once praised York's charm began whispering about replacements. Writers grew anxious about how to salvage storylines if York couldn't continue. Montgomery, who had already been at odds with his infatuation and erratic behavior, saw this as the final straw. Sympathy was replaced with frustration. Where fans saw a beloved character, she saw an actor whose problems were poisoning the set. York returned briefly, trying to push through his pain and prove he still had what it took. But the magic was gone. His collapse had shattered the illusion that he could keep up the charade. And with every falter, the tension between him and Montgomery deepened. To her, his failure to maintain professionalism wasn't just about illness, it was about trust. And once trust was broken, forgiveness was out of the question. The producers had a decision to make, and it would change the course of the show forever. York's collapse wasn't just a moment of weakness, it was the event that opened the door to his replacement. A shift that would leave him bitter, Montgomery cold, and fans wondering what had really happened behind the scenes. The fallout from that moment would only intensify when the new Darren arrived, and Elizabeth Montgomery's attitude toward York hardened into something she would never soften again. When Dick York left Bewitched, it wasn't with a grand farewell or warm send-off. It was abrupt, almost clinical. After his collapse and continuing health struggles, producers decided enough was enough. The solution? Bring in a new Darren. Enter Dick Sargent. On paper, it seemed like a simple fix. Just swap one actor for another and keep the magic alive. But for Elizabeth Montgomery, the change marked a turning point, not just for the show, but for how she felt about York. The truth is, Montgomery never pushed for York's return. By then, her patience had run dry. His infatuation, his unpredictability, and finally his collapse had drained her compassion. Once he was gone, she didn't look back. Some accounts suggest she even preferred working with Sargent, who was steady, professional, and far easier to manage on set. To Montgomery, the switch wasn't just about replacing an actor, it was about restoring order to her world. But audiences didn't exactly embrace the new Darren. Ratings took a hit. Fans complained that the chemistry wasn't the same, that something about the heart of the show had disappeared. The once beloved magic of Bewitched began to fade. And while Montgomery remained the star, the show's decline was unavoidable. York's absence left a void that no one could fill. York, meanwhile, watched from the sidelines as his role, the role he had helped define, was taken over. His health kept him from fighting back, but inside, resentment burned. Being replaced so quickly, with barely a nod to his years of work, stung deeply. He later admitted he never quite forgave how swiftly Hollywood moved on without him. Montgomery, however, didn't share that bitterness. If anything, her resentment toward York only deepened. Some believe she blamed him for the ratings slide, feeling that his personal struggles had tainted the show's reputation long before Sargent stepped in. To her, York wasn't just a fallen co-star, he was a reminder of the chaos she wanted to leave behind. The cold reality is that Montgomery and York never reconciled. No warm reunions, no heartfelt apologies. When he left, the door shut, and she never opened it again. To fans, it seemed harsh. To Montgomery, it seemed necessary. But as the years went by, and rumors swirled about whether she ever forgave him, a darker layer of myth began to grow, one fueled by stories of deathbeds, secret visits, and a supposed tenderness that history has now exposed as nothing more than fiction. After Dick York's exit from Bewitched, his life spiraled in heartbreaking ways. He battled declining health, financial struggles, and a career that never fully recovered. By the 1980s, York was almost entirely out of the spotlight, living quietly while dealing with emphysema. When he passed away in 1992, tributes from fans poured in. But what caught fire wasn't just the grief, it was the rumors. Stories began circulating that Elizabeth Montgomery had visited York on his deathbed, offering forgiveness after decades of silence. It sounded poetic, the kind of closure fans wanted to believe. But here's the truth: it never happened. Those claims were myths, spun from speculation and repeated until they started to sound real. In reality, Montgomery never reconnected with York after he left Bewitched. There was no tearful reunion, no heartfelt apology exchanged between the two. She had long moved on, focused on her career, her marriages, and her own battles. To York, her absence was noticeable. To Montgomery, it was intentional. What's fascinating is how these myths grew stronger over time. In fan circles, they became cemented as fact. People wanted to believe that the bitterness dissolved in the end, that Hollywood's fractured couple found peace before it was too late. Even modern retellings and AI-generated fact sites repeat the same tale, blending truth and fiction until the lines blur. It's a perfect example of how Hollywood legends are rewritten, not by the people who lived them, but by the people who can't let them go. For Montgomery, forgiveness was never part of the story. If anything, she distanced herself more and more from York's legacy. She rarely spoke about him in interviews, and when she did, her words carried a measured tone, neither cruel nor compassionate, but detached. It was as though she'd erased him from her personal history, even while the world remembered Samantha and Darren as an unshakable pair. That silence only made the myths grow louder. Fans clung to the fantasy of reconciliation because the alternative was too sad, that two people who had once created magic together ended up as strangers. But the reality is colder and far more revealing. Elizabeth Montgomery couldn't forgive Dick York, not because of one single incident, but because of the accumulation of everything he represented. The infatuation she never wanted, the unpredictability she never tolerated, and the collapse that broke the show's foundation. And that brings us to the final, hidden truth. The one thing that Montgomery carried to her grave, the real reason she never let go of the resentment. At the core of Elizabeth Montgomery's coldness toward Dick York was something deeper than irritation or professional inconvenience. It wasn't just about the awkward crush, the painkiller haze, or even the public collapse that humiliated the set. What truly cut her off from forgiveness was the sense of betrayal. Betrayal of trust, betrayal of professionalism, and betrayal of the image she worked so hard to uphold. Montgomery lived under enormous pressure. She wasn't just the star of Bewitched, she was its heart and soul. Her name was the draw, her face was on every poster, and her marriage to producer Bill Asher meant she carried the weight of both the performance and the production itself. She had to be the steady one, the anchor. And in her eyes, York became the opposite: unreliable, unstable, and unpredictable. He made her job harder, her personal life messier, and her reputation shakier. The thing about Montgomery was that she craved control. On screen, Samantha could twitch her nose and fix chaos with a snap of magic. Off screen, Montgomery had no such power. York's erratic behavior was a reminder that she couldn't control everything, that the man standing opposite her in scene after scene might crack at any moment. And for a perfectionist, that was unforgivable. Then there was the personal wound, the crush. York's puppy dog devotion may have seemed harmless to outsiders, but to Montgomery, it crossed a boundary. She wasn't just his co-star, she was a married woman, and his affections made her feel cornered. It forced her to live with tension she never asked for, day after day. No matter how innocent his feelings may have been, they left a scar on her sense of respect for him. Finally, his collapse sealed it. For Montgomery, that wasn't just the end of York's career, it was the day she lost faith in him completely. She saw a man who couldn't hold himself together, and to her, that failure meant he'd jeopardized everything they'd built. Forgiveness would have required empathy, but Montgomery chose distance instead, and she never looked back. To fans, it feels tragic. Two people adored as television's perfect couple, secretly divided by wounds that never healed. But to Montgomery, it was simple. Dick York wasn't the man the world thought he was. He was a burden, a problem, and a reminder of chaos she wanted erased from her story. That's why she never forgave him. Not at the time, not later, not even in death. The hidden truth is that for Elizabeth Montgomery, Dick York was not a partner, but a mistake, and she carried that judgment to the very end.